Botond Szemes, who is a researcher at the Center for Digital Text Scholarship at University of Tartu, Estonia. His research field is in the field of computational literary studies, including stylometry, computational drama analysis, and theoretical studies on the role of statistical operations and data visualization in knowledge production. He also works on history of Hungarian literature after Second World War and the possibilities of comparative studies in Central Europe. Yes. So today Botond will talk about a sentence-based stylistic history of the Hungarian novel. This is basically the topic of his PhD, which he finished 2 years ago at the Institute of Literary Studies in Budapest. So Botond, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yes. That's it. Yes, thank you. The idea was because there's this bilateral project or relations between the Institute for Literary Studies in Budapest and here in Bratislava, that we can travel between the two institutions and give lectures or participate in conferences or just doing research. And we had the idea that one presentation would be interesting here about this dissertation project, which also appeared in this book, which is unfortunately in Hungarian. So most of you maybe can't read it, but today the idea is to summarize this book. I also have 2 copies with me. I can leave in the library or wherever you keep the books here. So yeah, and it has a very ambitious title called Computational Literary Studies, and the aim is, or this is the first comprehensive introductory to the field in Hungarian, which is computational literary studies, a kind of subfield of digital humanities concerning about literary text, literary history, you name it. The first half of the book, it's more theoretical or methodological, but more reflections on the field and what's going on in what is computational literary studies at all. And the aim here is to embed this new field in the history of the European cultural history, in the cultural history of the European modernity. What I mean about this cultural history is that in computational literary studies and in digital humanities in general, it is very visible and very obvious that the different kind of practices work together and complement each other. Practices that we all know from, let's say, traditional humanities, discursive practices like reading, interpreting, understanding, contextualizing cultural phenomena. But on the other hand, non-discursive practices like computational counting, computing, or visualizing data visualization. And I argue in this first half of the book that on the one hand, these non-discursive practices like data visualization or the different, let's call them diagrammatic practices, and the computational practices were always part of the European modernity and European culture. For example, the whole story of the European modernity could be told along the story of these changes of these diagrammatic or visual changes, starting from the different grid systems like the perspective drawing, where you have a grid system and place the element of the outside reality according to logic, to the modern maps, which uses the same grid system, or the book printing, which again uses this grid system to place the letters in the surface of the plane. And these inventions are the starting point of this story, the European modernity, from the point of view of the diagrams or diagrammatic reasoning. And the end point is the statistical graphs, which are all over nowadays. And there's one argument in the book that they are so much present in our digital life, the statistical graphs, the other statistical procedures, the big data, and all these things, that if we would like to reflect on this situation, these contemporary situations, and humanities should be a place where these reflections should be made, we can detach ourselves and say that, okay, we don't care about these because they are not discursive and they are not familiar to us, and we don't deal with them. If we do this, we just lost the opportunity to really reflect on what's happening in this contemporary digital world. On the one hand, on the other hand, I believe that these practices are very powerful way of knowledge generation, and can be useful also in the different fields of humanities, also in the field of literary studies. So on the one hand, as a humanistic reflection, we should get familiar with these procedures. On the other hand, we can use these procedures to write, for example, literary history kind of new way. Here, one of the biggest argument is, maybe you all familiar with, that so far, if we write literary histories, we always pick some important names, the canon, and we write the story of this canon. But if we have much extensive data, then we can write more representative, more detailed literary history, for example. But this is just one example. Sometimes it's not very revolutionary. Sometimes you just have a kind of idea from data processing, and then you go back to the text themselves and you do proper literary studies as we used to. Sometimes it's just a different perspective to look at already known phenomena, but I think all these possibilities are worth to explore. So yeah, this first part is about these practices, the history of these practices, and how they can complement each other in the field of computational literary studies. I'm happy to discuss these ideas later, but today I would like to speak more about the second part of the book, which contains case studies of this about the Hungarian literary history. It's not so they are not case studies for all the problems and ideas that are in the first part of the book. It's mostly about Hungarian novels, so just one genre, one literary tradition, and from the point of view of stylistics. Because in computational literary studies, stylistics has a kind of new revitalized in this field, just because of a very basic assumption that, of course, we can define the characteristic, the stylistics of a text from different points of view, but we can also, there's one reasonable definition. If there are some linguistic elements which are more representative of a text than other texts, or more representative for a period, or a group of text, or a genre, or an author, then these linguistic elements are play an important role in this specific style. This linguistic element can be words, group of words, sentences, part of speeches like nouns or verbs, any types of elements that are meaningful to us and that are detectable algorithmically. But the basic idea is that if we measure these kind of linguistic elements, and there are some, on the one hand, historical tendencies, thank you very much. On the other hand, there are some patterns that, let's say, an author uses much more type of words than the others, then it should be a sign of this of his or her own literary style. It's a very simple and basic assumption, but it makes this is the assumption behind measuring the differences between these stylistics, which also mean that it's not an overall definition of style, but it's a very good definition to do the measurements, and it's a very operative definition. And in my book, I try to use these measurements and the results of the measurements and the patterns to complement and to test against, let's say, traditional history of Hungarian stylistics or traditional literary history. So here, there's no really opposition between quantitative or qualitative or distant or close readings, but they can, I believe, complement each other. And these case studies about how I try to do this or maintain this relationship between the two kinds of approaches and the two kind of knowledge they generate. Yes, so it's about style, and of course it's a question that what are the meaningful linguistic elements that we measure, because maybe there's a difference between one authors and others in some words, like let's say word voter, but maybe it doesn't tell us anything about his or her style. But I believe that there are other categories that are much more meaningful to us, and that's why I focused in this book to the level of the sentence, because on the one hand it has connections to the whole idea of a text, to higher levels of a text, like the whole structure of a text. But also it has connections to lower levels, to the syntax of a text or to the word distribution. So it's a good middle level, let's say. And traditionally, the Hungarian literary history, it's very much focused on this level of sentence, and mostly from the second part of the 20th century, this sentence-based poetics in the Hungarian history of novels. It's very common to describe these different poetics based on different sentences, how they are structured and how they look like. So that's why I focused on the sentences. And the case studies are pretty simple, easy, but I try to use them, these easy measurements and easy methods to show that how can we use the emerging patterns of quantitative analysis in the field of literary studies, especially in context of Hungarian novels. Sorry. Yes. I had a corpus of 150 Hungarian canonical novels from 1932 to 2005, which means the second half of this corpus, it's not open access. I had the right to use them, but I can't publish them on my own. The first parts are from public domain. And canonical means I had different criterias. I mostly followed the criteria from the LTEC European text collection initiative, where the canonicity was defined based on the publishing history. So if a book was published after a year, after the first appearance of the book several times, there are some rules for that we can consider these books canonical. But I supplemented this idea with just to revisit Hungarian literary histories, and basically I included all the books that are mentioned or in detail in these literary histories from the 21st century. I believe that there are not many, maybe no canonical Hungarian novelists that are missing from this canon. Maybe some works are missing, but the authors themselves represent well this canon. I strongly believe that. On the other hand, this corpus reflects just the canon. So sometimes, as in the title of the presentation, I say that the Hungarian novel, but we have to be cautious because it's just a portion of it, and this is the canon from a contemporary point of view. What was also important that it's evenly distributed. The novels are evenly distributed along this time scale, which means I divided the years into 10 equal parts, and I tried to have equal number of tags from each part. So if we gonna see the historical trends, it's not because of the imbalance in the corpus. It was one of the hardest and most important part to do this balanced corpus in terms of type, and it resulted then almost every year from every year a novel. Altogether, there are 98 authors and just 11 women authors, which is clearly an imbalance in the corpus. And again, it's not the Hungarian the history of the Hungarian novel. It's a contemporary canon, and the imbalance is itself in the canon. And there are authors. The maximum number of books from an author is 4. In the case if they lived a long period and worked for many decades, and it's meaningful to include more books to also have some ideas of individual changes, or whether the changes in a style of one author follows the general patterns. But mostly I have 1 or 2 books from an author. Yes, that was the corpus. Why 1932 is the starting point? Arguably, this is the time when the first Hungarian novel in a modern sense appeared. And 2005, it's a bit arbitrary. It would be very difficult to include canonical works from the really contemporary Hungarian literature, because we don't really have these criteria. And 2005, Pétera Nádasa Parallel Stories was the last book I included. First, the very first sentence-based measurement, it's the simplest one. It was basically just to measure the average length of the sentences in the books, which I did just chunk the text into sentences and then chunk the sentences into words. And then I checked on average how long is a sentence in the book. So it's kind of banal perspective to deal with novels. But when I projected the results. This is just the first part, or it's to the 1960s, so it's not the whole corpus, but I wanted to highlight the finding in the late 19th century, so from the beginning of the corpus to the change of the century, there's a clear declining tendency in the history of Hungarian novels in terms of sentence length, which means that on average there is a strong correlation between the time of creation and the average length of the sentences. And already this very simple trend and metric was helpful to me to speculate on what's happening in the Hungarian literary studies, literary history, why this very visible formal change is happening. The two main reasons in my analysis was the decline of the classical rhetoric tradition in the Hungarian literacy at all. The high values here in the first half of the 19th century is almost always authors who follow these rhetorical traditions with long sentences. We'll have some examples from, for example, Józsefa Eötvösa, who has this very long, very well-structured rhetorical sentences, like these kind of structures with parallel clauses, like here was the boy who had the presentation, who drink a glass of water, who etc., said that it's nice to be here. So something like this kind of very strict rhetorical formulation of sentences, which is reflected also in the education of the contemporary, I mean that time contemporary teaching of literature, and maybe this decreasing tendency is also reflects the decrease in the or the effect of this rhetorical tradition. The other tendency which I analyzed is the appearances of journals and the new media of publishing novels, and I argue that it's also had the consequence of the stylistic change, which is also reflected in the decreasing length of the sentences. What's also interesting or useful in these graphs that I could, because these are tendencies that we are already familiar with it, but I could locate the big turning points. I could locate some kind of authors, for example, like this here, who are not following the trend, but they are kind of outliers and still, for example, maintaining a rhetorical tradition or refusing to publish in journals. I could also outline kind of forerunners, for example, these authors who already writes in a different way, which will be a trend later on. So these kind of big pictures were helpful to me to detect these actual positions and the actual turning points, actual comparison with authors with 150 or 149 other books, and to see everything at once, not just to speculate on the historical trends, which are not that unfamiliar to us. What was also interesting that I saw that I included 4 books from Moriokai in the corpus, and they followed this decreasing trend. So I created a yokai corpus with 23 novels from the 1940s to the end of the 1990s, and it was also interesting to see how he follows the trend himself, which on the one hand says that this trend, it's let's say, stronger than the individual considerations or the individual style. Or on the other hand, it's also reasonable to think that József was so influential, so he's one who is not just not just the overall trend affects him, but maybe he also one of the forerunners or the one who put this trend into motion. But yeah, this was also a kind of complementary analysis. Here is the whole corpus. So the previous version here, it was just cut down here in the 60s, because as you see, there are some extremely long sentence poetics from the end of the 20th century. Sorry, it's about, it's in Hungarian, but the red ones are the mean values and the greenish ones are the median values. They are pretty similar, and it doesn't really affect the overall trends. But as you see from the second part, from the 60s, 70s in the Hungarian literature, there are novels with extremely high values, which means extremely long sentences. There are ones who stay in this low region. There are ones, for example, Ivan Mandi, who is even shorter than anyone else in the corpus, which can be represented also in this way to cluster the novels. To the red ones are the long sentences in a period. The green ones are the medium scores, and the blue ones are the short ones. I can tell you how these groups are created. But what's interesting here that the distance between these groups are much higher than, or much bigger than before, which means that there's a much bigger diversity, which is also visible here between the novels in terms of basic sentence length measure. But as a next step, and in the book as a next chapter, I wanted to go further and go more in detail, because okay, long sentence, it maybe doesn't it isn't the same for two different authors. They both have long sentences, but maybe completely different types of sentences, and this is just a very overall picture, but I also wanted to analyze the structure of these sentences and to see trends in it. And that's why I had the, okay, sorry, before going there, it's just one example that maybe there are some trends within individual works. It's the sorstalanság, the facelessness from Imreho Kertésza, the Nobel Prize winner book, where here you can see all the sentences and the length of the sentences, and here it's a kind of statistical line which outlines the trend within the data. Here it's just the chapters and the average sentence lengths of chapters. Both graphs suggest that there is some kind of arc in terms of sentence lengths within one book, which makes possible to interpret this only book, this individual book, along this kind of change in rhythm, change in dramaturgy. I don't go into detail right now, but I just wanted to include this example that not just the broad picture, but also a close analysis of one book is maybe meaningful, because now it can reveal that kind of pattern, which is, I believe, meaningful in the context of this novel. We can talk about that later, but it's here now just an example. But going further, the structure of these sentences, and I had the idea to measure the distribution of close linkages, which means that how the separate clauses in these sentences relate to each other. For example, the weather was cold, but I went hiking. In this sentence, there's a but type contradictory or adversative relation. And there are many others. For example, because of the weather, I went hiking here. Now there's a more logical connection and this because type of connection. And the idea was that if we measure these different, if we can detect these connections automatically, and if we can measure distribution of the separate relation types, then on the first level we have a very rich linguistic data to describe the style or the structure of these sentences. But on the other hand, it's easy to interpret this data not just in terms of style, but I think it's reasonable to think that it's a different character of its text. It has a different word view if it uses much more but type contradictions between the clauses than other text, which organizes the clauses and the element of the outside reality in other types of connections. If one connection is more characteristic for a period or for an author or for a text, it's not just about style, but it's also about this kind of rhetorical logic of the text, or at least what kind of relations is used to describe how things relate together, let's say. There's also a literature of these kind of approaches, which say that these are on the one hand grammatical categories, but on the other hand they have kind of these semiotical and discursive aspects, and they are the basis, these close linkages of the functional topological framework of a text. There's all other arguments that these kind of close linkages are like grammaticalized versions of rhetorical relations between larger units of the text. So the idea was that if we measure these relative frequencies of the different linkages, it can shed light to the underlying rhetorical logical structure of a text. And it's good that in Hungarian the close boundaries is always marked with the some kind of interpunctuation sign, prototypically with a comma or semicolon or things like that. And I was just simply search for these signs and the conjunction word like but or because or therefore, you name it, and or the relative pronouns like where, which, that, and so on. And that was the basis of the method. At that time, I used this kind of rule-based method. The data which we generated can be used to do more advanced text analysis, to, for example, teach a model to recognize these kind of connections, and maybe it will be more sophisticated, but still it seems meaningful, which has one implication that I measured just the relation types which are elaborated with a conjunction word. So if the but is missing, I didn't take into account, and I couldn't categorize the close linkage or the relationship between the clauses in this sense. And I had great amount of help from linguists, colleagues, who we had hundreds of examples from the corpus with almost each combination, and we categorized each sentence by, or each occasion by hand. And then if one combination was describing one type of relation after a threshold, then we included this combination. Otherwise, like the that type of combination, which can mean anything, basically, hogy in Hungarian, we discarded it from the research. And we had these 12 categories: copulative relation, prototypically with an and, the adversative with a but, disjunctive with or, inferential typically with so or thus. There's applicatory, there's no strict equivalent in English grammar, but like name it, namely, or that is, these kind of connections. It's quite similar to inferential, but has a different meaning and different semantics a bit than the so and thus type of connections. The conditional, which is pretty straightforward, mainly with if. The concessive, like although. We also measure the similes with as, like, type of connections, the logical one with because, and three types of relative clauses. One is the prototypical relative clause, the who, which type of connections, and there's this one regarding to space and one regarding to time. And after the manual inspection of the data, we categorize each conjunction word to these categories if it was possible to categorize, and then we did the measurement in this category level. And first, there were some clear historical trends. For example, the prototypical relative clauses. You can see here, it's pretty similar to the decrease of the sentence lengths, and these rhetorical structure that I mentioned are mostly used, these kind of parallel structures with relative clauses. For example, Józsefa Eötvösa. So it was not a big surprise that there were the authors with the highest percentage of prototypical relative clauses are from the 19th century. Of course, it was interesting that what's happening here, who are these authors who try to write in a more, let's say, rhetorical and formal way than in the previous decades. And of course, there are other authors who are who have long sentence poetics from the 19th century, but not using these kind of abundance of relative clauses. The other trend is the peak of similes in the beginning of 20th century. Oh, sorry, these bars are just, it's basically the same plot, but I have these year groups of 15 years and had the mean values of the these groups, and I also charted these 15 years tendencies, but it's basically the same data, just another way to show it. So yeah, similes in the first half of 20th century, and this is the inferential clauses, the so and thus type of sentences. You can see that it is mostly characteristics for the 20th century, second half of 20th century, long sentence novels, but there are also some from the beginning of the 19th century where they don't use the rhetorical tradition, or they don't rely much on the rhetorical tradition, and they don't use these relative pronouns to build long sentences, but more these inferential type of connections like so or thus or therefore. And this is the explicatory type, which is, on the other hand, exclusively characteristic for some of the 20th century, late 20th century novels. That is namely these kind of connections. All in all, these historical tendencies, there are three big peaks: the relative clauses in the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of 20th century, the similes, and the explanation and clarification with inferential clauses. In summary, relative clauses provide a more detailed description of a character in the main clause by representing them in a new scene, which fixes the meaning of a sentence. It's kind of a definition. The boy who still haven't drank from the water, and so on. So this kind of detailed description. By contrast, these types, so the inferential and explicatory types, are constant clarification and explanation of something, very typical for Imreho Kertésza, Lászlóa Krasznahorkaia, also for Pétera Nádasa, not exclusively, which assumes a less fixed or semantically rest anchored access to the word. So it's not like a definition, but it's more subjective point of view with these constant clarification of the situations, and it's more flexible meaning. There's always new conclusions. And the third paradigm is similes can provide new information by comparing two ideas or simply pointing to the common features. In this case, the focus is not on the characterization or elaboration, but on the creating an analogy, like in every similes. And this is the peak of the beginning of 20th century with the so-called impressionistic Hungarian prose, where the high number of similes is visible in this graph. There's another way to represent this data. You can also represent the inner portion of the different types within a novel. So here every bar is one novel, and the color code is about the different types and distribution within this novel. I also made some joint categories like inferential and explicatory, it's together here, or adversative and disjunctive, because of the similarity between their meanings and to make more visible or easier to understand the graphs. And they can be useful because, for example, you can see that relative closes, this or yellow bar is always, not always, but mostly always has the highest percentage within a novel, but there are differences that how big is this percentage. There is this Eötvösa József. These are two novels from Eötvösa József with a very high percentage, but there are others like, for example, here Imreho Kertésza, these two novels less so. And then you can describe, for example, a text where there are not many different types of closed languages in any type, but the internal structure is still interesting. For example, Ivan Mandi, he loves to write short sentences, a lot of dialogues without so much relations, but if he does, then the similes are much more characteristic for this prose than the other texts. I had also the idea based on this representation that it's visible that authors, novels from the same author, are more similar to each other than to other authors. For example, this is two novels from Józsefa Eötvösa, and they are pretty similar, these graphs, compared to the others. Or these two novels from Ádám Bodor, again, they are similar to each other. These two Dezső Kosztolányi, to Imreho Kertésza, to Pétera Nádasa, and to Miklósa Mészölyho. Here, and it gave me an idea, maybe this is also a good indicator of the authorial style in this sense, which has the context of the big research field of authorship attribution, where they try to localize the authorial fingerprint, the characteristic of an authorial style based on quantitative measures. And it turned out in other researches that just the distribution of the most frequent words are very similar in texts from the same authors, or much more similar than texts than other texts from other authors. And this is the best practice nowadays to computationally, for example, detect the author of an unknown text or a text of an unknown author. So just the distribution of the most frequent words, which is a bit provocative to our understanding of individual style, because the most frequent words are always these non-semantic word categories, function words like the, and, or, you name it, these kind of, so not from the open word categories like nouns or verbs, but still the distribution of these words are the best indicator to differentiate between authors. And then I realized that conjunction words are part of these function words. So maybe it's also a good indicator for the individual authorial style. But on the other hand, it's much easier to interpret than just the distribution of non-semantic words. And I try to cluster the authors based on these data with statistical procedures. We can also talk about these methodological details. What I wanted to show that in the most cases it works pretty well. For example, here are the novels from Józsefa Eötvösa from this subset of the corpus. These are the authors with more than one books from the subcorpus. But there are other cases where this clusterization is not that perfect. For example, Magda Szabó, as I remember well, yeah, there's one model here and two here. So there are some mistakes, but it's overall works quite well. And here the interpretation was that this kind of the frequency of the close linkages, or this relationship between the clauses, are let's say some subconscious level of the writing procedure. In the most cases, the authors are not reflected on that. Okay, now I will use a but type of relation instead of anything else because this is my writing style. But on the other hand, if they want to change their style according to the topic or according to the narrator or anything like that, then it can be very well the case that they changes also this kind of structure of the text. And that's why it sometimes works well, but sometimes not so. And the last graph I wanted to show is the two-dimensional representation of all the text. Here is just highlighted some of the texts that were discussed so far, but the whole graph is based on all the novels. And in this two-dimensional graph, it's based on all the 12 categories, but the axis it just reduces these 12 dimensions just to 2 and try to keep the meaningful difference between individual data points, in this case novels. And it can be interesting where some novels are positioned, but the most interesting for me to see how the different types affect the position of the data points. And you can see there's clear two big directions. One is the so-called subordinations, so the conditional, the similes, the relative space and relative time type of connections are in this direction, and the graph affects if you have a lot of relative clauses and space and time, then your novel will be here, like Józsefa Eötvösa. And these are the so-called subordinations, with the exception of causal relationship, the because type of relation, which is very similar to the inferential and explicatory, also in terms of semantics. So based on these representation, it was made possible to distinguish three big, let's say, stylistic tradition. One is more heavily rely on the relative clauses and the subordinations. The other is more about a logical structure of a text with causal, explanatory, inferential, but also adversative and disjunctive. connections. And the third type is the authors here who don't really use this kind of relations that often. They use a short sentence poetics where the relations are not elaborated that often. And this can be also a very important sign of an individual style if you don't use something that often as the others. And in another chapter of the book, it was one of the leading paths to describe Mészölyho Miklós prose style, where there are some kind of missing categories, mostly these logical connections between the clauses in his text. And it was quite, I don't know, revealing or interesting to describe his style in terms of what he doesn't elaborate and what's the, let's say, theoretical or philosophical implications behind not elaborate a logical or causal relation between clauses. So yeah, these are the three big traditions, and of course you can always go into the data and see individual novels where they position themselves within these three big broad categories.
5 more minutes?
Or just
so
one?
We have for discussion.
Yeah, that's all. I think that's what I just said, that the three big traditions, and basically that's all. Thank you very much.
What about the examples that you wanted to show? Translations?
Yes, I kind of.
It's up to you.
Yeah, I kind of forgot it, but just to have first the English versions. This is a sentence from the József quoted many times, this kind of relative clauses in a rhetorical structure. This is the original Hungarian, and this is the English translation. Is it visible?
No.
What does it do? No, it's just that. Lupa. So, for example, you who were the cause of my ruin, you who, etc., etc., etc. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parallel clauses defining one subject of the main clause. In this case, who. This is a similar example here, but here is not one subject is defined with different clauses, but different subjects with the same structure. It's also a kind of typical to this kind of style. And there is also some kind of.
We can't really see it.
Okay, yeah, okay.
It doesn't.
But the good thing that these analyses, it's appeared in this journal called Journal for Computational Literary Studies last year. So if you're really interested on the examples and the method, that you can read the article here. Okay.
Wow.
Thank you.